Hello, our names are Gracie Boutilier, Christina Paolozzi, and Megan Wilson. Today, we're going to discuss power, oppression, ableism, and teaching, what it all means to you. Our presentation is centered on ideas presented in chapters 5 and 6 of Sensoy and D'Angelo's Is Everyone Really Equal? An Introduction to Key Concepts in Social Justice Education. Chapter 5 unpacks the concepts of power and oppression, while Chapter 6 focuses on privilege through the lens of ableism. The speaker will be identified by a small icon in a top corner of the screen. This is Gracie, this is me, Christina, and this is Megan. A quick overview of our presentation is as follows. First, Gracie will define key terms which we will be using throughout the presentation, and then unpack key ideas surrounding the concept of oppression. After this, I will explore notions of power and Foucault's theory of the panopticon. Megan will then explore the ways in which language perpetuates power and oppression before discussing concepts of oppression through the lens of ableism. Before we dive into this presentation, we want to begin by offering some important definitions for the terms that will be used throughout this presentation. Social stratification explains that humans are organized into social groups that are relationally positioned within a hierarchical system. One's race, gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity are among the social groups that people can be organized into. Prejudice, the learned prejudgment about members of social groups that one does not belong to. Power. When we discuss power, we are referring to when those with authority use ideological, technical, and discursive elements to impose their ideas and interests onto minoritized groups. Oppression. Oppression occurs when prejudice and prejudicial actions are backed by power, specifically historical, social, and institutional power. It is important to note that while all groups have the ability to discriminate, oppression can only occur from a group that holds power. Privilege. When individuals with privilege are members of the dominant group who are not held back by the systems that are already in place. In fact, the system will already inherently favor them and propel them forward. Hegemony. Hegemony is the imposition of the dominant group or group's ideology onto everyone in society.
Oppression can exist against any minoritized group from a dominant group. These oppressions are often referred to as isms. Some ism examples are racism, the oppression of non-Caucasian people, sexism, the oppression of non-cis men, and heterosexism, the oppression of non-heterosexual people. For our presentation, we'll be focusing specifically on ableism, which is the oppression of people with disabilities. Sensoy and D'Angelo explain that oppression is, quote, a multidimensional imbalance of social, political, and institutional power that builds over time and then becomes normal and acceptable to most people in the society. They further explain that oppression has 4 key elements. It is historical, ideological, institutional, and cultural. Burnett and Figley explain that historical oppression describes the pervasive and intergenerational experiences of oppression that, over time, may be normalized, imposed, and internalized into the daily lives of minoritized groups. They further explain that oppression cannot be simply undone in a day's effort either. Because these oppressive systems have taken generations to establish and normalize, they will take quite a long time to reverse as well. Consider today how students with demanding physical disabilities are segregated at school from the able-bodied students. Historically, people have seen those with disabilities as less valuable members of society that needed to be ostracized, and those same practices continue to exist now. To understand the idea that oppression is ideological, we first need to ask, what is ideology? Within the frame of this discussion, ideology refers to the dominant shared ideas of a society that are reinforced throughout all of its institutions. Typically, the dominant ideology of a society has been developed and disseminated by the dominant group and actively works against minoritized groups, even if the people in the dominant group themselves do not realize it. Sensoy and D'Angelo note that oppression is embedded within individual consciousness through socialization, meaning that once people are socialized into a position within the hierarchy defined by social stratification, they're unlikely to try to remove themselves from that position, thus securing the continuation of injustice. One of the biggest problems with ideological oppression is that it leads to people believing that these constructs are natural. Within the frame of ableism, we can return back to the idea that persons with disabilities have historically been viewed as less capable and in turn less valuable. This belief is so ingrained in North American society that people with visible disabilities will often be passed over for jobs because employers may feel, as Kay et al. Suggest, that employing such a worker will entail an added burden to managers, supervisors, and human resource staff. When a belief is so systemic, it is hard to remove it from the collective consciousness. Major institutions have been developed to work for dominant groups and against minoritized groups. Some of the major oppressive institutions include the media, medicine, criminal justice, industry, higher education, and religion. Each of these institutions has been historically and ideologically developed against minoritized groups in such a way that the institutions themselves are now oppressive. Consider sidewalk infrastructure. It was not until 1990 that curb cuts were made mandatory with the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Our societies were built around catering to the needs of the dominant group over the minoritized, which has contributed to institutional oppression everywhere. The historical, ideological, and institutional elements of oppression make it inescapable. Sensoy and D'Angelo go so far as to suggest that, quote, oppression is embedded in all dimensions of culture, end quote. Because of the inescapable nature of oppression, minoritized groups often feel more accepted and successful when they display characteristics of the dominant group. In short, they try to fit in. This burden is explained as a double consciousness, wherein minoritized groups feel pressured to perform the dominant culture's norms as well as their own. Consider someone with an invisible disability, such as chronic pain. While a person with chronic pain is experiencing consistent physical pain, they may shrug this off around able-bodied people to not be perceived as a complainer or as less capable of carrying out tasks or having fun. This forces the minoritized person to hide part of themselves in an effort to blend into the dominant group and not be perceived as less than.
One of the ways that we can look at the structure of social stratification further is through the philosophy of 20th century French scholar Michel Foucault. Sensoy and D'Angelo describe power as, quote, the ideological, technical, and discursive elements by which those in authority impose their ideas and interests on everyone, end quote. Foucault helps us to contextualize and reconsider the ways in which power is present in every one of our interactions, and also provides a key example of how power is used by the dominant group in society. In an interview between François Calais, a French director and writer, and French philosopher and art historian Georges Didier Huberman, they discuss the impact of Foucault's work on the world of art history, and I believe this is a great medium to begin to understand the type of power that is most often exercised onto society by the dominant group. This power is exercised by the gaze, exerted from one group onto another. Didier Huberman states that the gaze often used when individuals regard a painting is the same gaze that Foucault suggests the dominant group uses when interacting with the minoritized group. This gaze creates discourse, ideology, and contributes to the socialization of society, and is often constructed and studied without the knowledge of the subject being painted. Just as thousands of people gaze on the Mona Lisa at the Louvre to perhaps discuss the presence or lack thereof of her smile, so too can we understand that Mona Lisa herself has been excluded from the discourse and is unable to contribute to the dominant group's understanding of the current narrative. Foucault further allows us to understand power in society in his famous analysis of what is known as the panopticon, a 19th century prison structure that uses light to, quote, create strategic darkness and blindness, end quote. This use of the gaze is also present here, as the main function of the panopticon is that prisoners don't know if or when they are being watched, ultimately encouraging a type of self-policing out of fear of the ever-present threat of the authority figure. Although his research concerns this example of a prison system, this system can be used to describe many other institutions within society, like the military, hospitals, and schools.
The scholarship and philosophy surrounding the panopticon suggests that the gaze being exerted on from authority figures like the warden, the general, the doctor, or the teacher or principal enforces the socialization of compliance with the discourse, ideologies, and general social norms that fit with the dominant group's interests. Sensoy and D'Angelo further state that members of the dominant group can be thought of as individuals who have the power in society to design, institute, and enforce the panopticon onto the minoritized group, which can be thought of as the individuals being watched. This view of the panopticon and its role in the school system is particularly interesting to explore, especially through the lens of ableism. There are visible ways in which schools assert the dominant ideology. An example of this could be the way that some students with disabilities are usually in their own classrooms, away from the rest of the student population, being observed and watched. But there are also many invisible ways this dominant ideology is portrayed, such as what Sensoy and D'Angelo call the, quote, internalization of messages of superiority, end quote. Everything at school is basically designed with able-bodied people in mind, which sends an invisible message to the minoritized group about the inherent superiority of the dominant group. This is just another manifestation of the gaze and the way in which the dominant group studies and regards the minoritized group. As fixed and as rigid these power structures may seem, especially through Foucault's example of the panopticon, Foucault ultimately suggests that these relationships are constantly reproduced and negotiated in society. While it is true that power exists everywhere, and that it is almost impossible to totally eliminate power from society, when individuals study and understand how power works in society, we then have the ability to challenge it.
Building from Foucault's theories of power and panopticon, it is important to examine the ways in which oppression is enacted through language. Language is never a neutral transmitter of objective fixed reality, but rather a means by which we construct the reality which we come to perceive. The ways in which we describe an experience have a direct impact on what we come to perceive as a fact about said experience in our society. Additionally, language is so much more than words, as all forms of communication can be considered a component of language. As such, language is just as much about what we say as what we don't say. Spoken words as language are only the tip of the metaphorical iceberg when it comes to not only how we communicate person to person, but the ways in which society at large views certain issues, with unspoken and internalized hegemonic ideas lying underneath the surface. The academic term for a discussion involving a variety of perspectives on a particular issue is a discourse. And when we have discourse, the power dynamics of language and oppression inevitably have an impact on the ways in which the issue is discussed. In terms of topics involving oppression, this not only includes the way in which it is discussed, but whose voices are privileged while others are silenced. For example, the upcoming film Music has been the center of a discourse involving autism and representation, as the main character, a nonverbal autistic girl, is portrayed by a neurotypical non-autistic actress. The autistic community has raised concerns that they are both underrepresented and misrepresented in a film which is supposedly centered on exploring their experience. As well, some argue that the film will both inadequately communicate the perspective of life as a disabled person, while perpetuating harmful stereotypes about autistic people, which are inherently rooted in ableism. To take a moment to reflect on how this example reflects the dynamic between language, power, and oppression. As the previous example suggested, it's now time to directly discuss power and oppression through the lens of ableism. To begin, I'd like to recall that Campbell states, quote, "From the moment a child is born, she emerges into a world where she receives messages that to be disabled is to be less than. A world where disability may be tolerated, but in the final instance is inherently negative. We are all, regardless of our subject positions, shaped and formed by the politics of ableism. As such, it is clear that ableism and the ideas which constitute it are rooted in the ways in which non-disabled people perceive disability. We are all part of an ableist society and possess hegemonic perpetuated ideas about disability, including notions of what constitutes a, quote, normal versus an, quote, abnormal body. Such ideas privileged how non-disabled people view those socially marked as different from them, rather than allowing disabled people themselves to contribute to the discourse surrounding their own existence and experience. Comedian and journalist Stella Young has some incredible insights into the dynamic of the ways in which non-disabled people dominate the discourse on disabled people through objectification in the form of inspiration.
To inspire. And in fact, I'm sitting on this stage looking like I do in this wheelchair, and you are probably kind of expecting me to inspire you, right? Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you dramatically. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to tell you that we have been lied to about disability. Yeah, we've been sold the lie that disability is a bad thing. Capital B, capital T. It's a bad thing. And to live with disability makes you exceptional. It's not a bad thing. And it doesn't make you exceptional. And in the past few years, we've been able to propagate this lie even further via social media. You may have seen images like this one. The only disability in life is a bad attitude. Or this one, your excuse is invalid, indeed. Or this one, before you quit, try. Yeah. These are just a couple of examples, but there are a lot of these images out there. You might have seen the little girl with no hands drawing a picture with a pencil held in her mouth. You might have seen a child running on carbon fibre prosthetic legs. And these images, there are lots of them out there. They are what we call inspiration porn. And I use the term porn deliberately because they objectify one group of people for the benefit of another group of people. So in this case, we're objectifying disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. The purpose of these images is to inspire you, to motivate you, so that we can look at them and think, well, however bad my life is, it could be worse. I could be that person. But what if you are that person? I've lost count of the number of times that I've been approached by strangers wanting to tell me that they think I'm brave or inspirational. And this was long before my work had any kind of public profile. They were just kind of congratulating me for managing to get up in the morning and remember my own name. And it is objectifying. These images objectify disabled people for the benefit of non-disabled people. They are there so that you can look at them and think that things aren't so bad for you, to put your worries into perspective. And life as a disabled person is actually somewhat difficult. We do overcome some things. But the things that we're overcoming are not the things that you think they are. They are not things to do with our bodies. I use the term disabled people quite deliberately because I subscribe to what's called the social model of disability, which tells us that we are more disabled by our bodies, the society that we live in rather, than by our bodies and our diagnoses.
To recap, oppression can be seen in all areas of society. It truly is inescapable. That is not to say that these systems cannot be changed, but rather that we need to recognize their problematic existence before this change can occur. It is no secret that dismantling historical, ideological, institutional, and cultural oppression will take a long time, but we can be part of the process of change now. As future educators, we have the ability to help shape the next generation and teach students about oppressive systems and how they can be part of creating a more inclusive world. Thank you so much for watching.